take a deep breath. Now, picture this. You're born into a world where hope is a luxury, where the air stinks of rot and the streets run with mud, blood, and disease, where the sky is dark not from nightfall, but from the ash of dying forests and burning villages. You're not dreaming. This was reality for millions. You're cold. You're hungry. You're terrified because the gods are silent and the plague is loud. Because every cough could be your last, and every stranger could bring death to your doorstep. This isn't a horror story. This is history. And it's not ancient myth. It's our past. There are chapters in humanity's timeline so bleak, so broken that they almost defy belief, but they happened, and the people in them were just like us. Breathing, bleeding, trying to survive one more day in a world that felt like it had given up on them. Tonight, we're not just telling a story. We're time traveling into the raw, unfiltered darkness of an era so cruel, it broke the human spirit and buried knowledge, compassion, and progress under centuries of fear. This is more than history. This is a journey through the ashes of civilization. This is the worst time to have ever been a human. And when it's over, when you finally open your eyes, you may look at your warm bed, your clean water, your quiet street, and realize that surviving today isn't just lucky. It's miraculous. Chapter 1, 536 AD. The year the sun disappeared, imagine waking up one morning to find the world blanketed not in fog, but in something far more sinister. A pale, smoky haze lingers in the air. The sun rises, but it's not golden, not warm, not bright. It hangs there, dim and expressionless, casting no proper shadows. As the day drags on, the light barely strengthens. It feels like twilight, all the time. You think it's temporary, but it goes on. The next day, and the day after, and the day after that. You look to your elders. You ask the priests. No one can explain it. Days turn into weeks, then months. The light remains gray and dull, as if the sun itself has fallen sick. This is no ordinary eclipse. It's not a passing cloud. It is 536 AD, and the sun has disappeared. What caused it? We know now, centuries later, that the likeliest culprit was a massive volcanic eruption, or perhaps a series of them. Somewhere far to the north, possibly Iceland or North America, an eruption ejected an enormous volume of ash and sulfur dioxide into the upper atmosphere. Carried by stratospheric winds, the volcanic plume circled the northern hemisphere, forming a veil that blocked sunlight from reaching the Earth. This was not a local phenomenon. It was global. Ancient records from around the world confirm the darkness. From the Mediterranean, the Byzantine historian Procopius wrote of a year unlike any other. The sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon. It seemed extremely like the sun in eclipse, for the beams it shed were not clear. From China, official records describe yellow dust falling like snow and frost during the summer. Snow fell in August. Crops failed. Locusts came, people starved. In Ireland, the Annals of Ulster recorded what they called a failure of bread, a wad, haunting phrase that quietly signals famine. We don't have detailed journal entries from peasants, but we can imagine what it must have felt like. Day after day, a gray ceiling loomed overhead. The temperature dropped by as much as 2.5 degrees Celsius across much of the northern hemisphere. It may not sound like much to us, but in an age without modern heating, agriculture, or storage systems, this was catastrophic. The cooling was enough to shift growing seasons. Crops failed across Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Asia. Harvests withered. Seeds planted in hope never sprouted. Even trees, the silent witnesses to time, showed signs of stress. Dendrochronology, the science of reading tree rings, reveals that 536 was one of the worst years for tree growth in over 2,000 years. Entire societies began to break under the weight of scarcity. The year 536 was not just a meteorological oddity. It was the first stone in a terrible cascade of disasters that would reverberate for more than a century. It marked the beginning of what some scholars call the late antique Little Ice Age. The climate did not return to normal for decades. You have to understand, this was not a world of centralized governments and global trade networks. Most people lived off what they could grow with their hands, within walking distance of their homes. If your crops failed, and your neighbor's crops failed and the nearest granary was empty, there was nowhere to turn. Famine does more than shrink bodies. It crushes spirits. It divides communities. It can turn kindness into suspicion, friendship into desperation. There are stories from this time, some whispered, some recorded, of people eating tree bark, clay, and worse. Entire villages may have disappeared. In some regions, religious rituals intensified. People believed the sun's dimming was divine punishment. They prayed louder. They sacrificed more. They looked to the heavens for signs, but the heavens remained gray and silent. Archaeological evidence shows a sharp increase in burials, and not just of the elderly. Children, mothers, farmers, soldiers, the forgotten dead of an era lost in shadow. The economic collapse was profound. Trade routes shriveled. Artisan goods vanished. Coins became rare. In some areas, people returned to bartering with grain or hides. The sense of progress that had briefly emerged in late antiquity was gone. Even great empires struggled. The Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantium, still ruled from Constantinople, but it was beset by internal strife, military threats, and now, nature's fury. In places like Egypt, traditionally the breadbasket of the Eastern Mediterranean, the Nile failed to flood properly, likely due to climate disruptions. That meant no silt, no crops, and no food. Riots followed. Grain ships did not come. In China's Northern Wei dynasty, records speak of widespread drought and frost in the middle of summer. Cattle died. So did humans. We will never know how many are perished in those gray years. The numbers are not written in ink or carved in stone. They are written in silence, in the abandoned settlements, the untended fields, the bones buried in shallow pits. Historians have tried to estimate. Hundreds of thousands? Millions? We don't know. What we do know is that this was not an isolated disaster. The climate effects lingered for more than a decade, and the trauma etched itself into the cultural memory of multiple civilizations. One might think the world could recover from a few hard years. But just as the skies began to brighten, another blow came. In 541, just 5 years after the world dimmed, the first pandemic of bubonic plague erupted. It started in Egypt, spread to Constantinople, and from there across the empire. It became known as the Plague of Justinian, but we'll speak of that in another chapter. The world in 536 had no understanding of aerosols, or volcanic sulfate, or pandemics. There was no science to explain what was happening, and so people made sense of it the only way they knew how, with stories, with faith, with fear. Some may have believed the world was ending. In a way, for many, it was. This was not the kind of apocalypse with fire and trumpets. It was quieter, slower, more haunting. It was an apocalypse of gray skies, of empty fields, of stomachs gnawing in the night. It was an apocalypse of lost days, where noon looked like dusk, and dusk looked like death. In the modern age, we take the sun for granted. It rises, it warms, it grows our food. It marks our days. But in 536, the sun became a stranger. Its warmth faded, its light grew weak, and in its absence, the world shivered. No armies came to destroy cities. No single tyrant caused the collapse. It was nature, indifferent, vast, unstoppable. And when people looked up, hoping for a sign, all they saw was the pale disk of a dying sun, and the beginning of the worst time to be human. Chapter 2. Famine and Collapse. The year the sun dimmed was only the beginning. For those alive in 536 AD and the years that followed, the most immediate and unforgiving enemy was not the darkened sky, nor even the bitter cold. It was hunger. The crops failed. In a world built on subsistence farming, this was not merely an inconvenience. It was a death sentence. Across the northern hemisphere, from Europe to Asia, fields that once yielded wheat, barley, millet, and rice now gave nothing. Seeds planted in early spring did not sprout. Plants that had begun to grow withered under unnatural frost. Flowers failed to bloom. Bees without nectar disappeared. Even fruit trees, so essential to small communities, stayed barren. Farmers were the backbone of early medieval societies. But even the most skilled cultivator was powerless against the climate. As the seasons turned strange, summer cold, autumn, dry, winter long, human hands could not force the earth to provide. In Ireland, where monastic scribes recorded the world in careful detail, a haunting phrase appears in the annals: a failure of bread. It lasted for years. Bread was more than a foodstuff. It was life. To say bread failed was to say life itself had begun to crumble. In the Eastern Roman Empire, the effects were just as severe. Though Constantinople still sparkled with imperial gold and distant military campaigns, the countryside told a different story. Farmers could not pay their taxes. Grain shipments slowed. Urban markets shrank. In the cities, food prices soared. The poor went hungry. The desperate turned violent. China, too, suffered greatly. Official records from the Northern Wei dynasty describe frost falling in summer, droughts crippling farmland, and locusts devouring what little remained. In some provinces, famine consumed entire communities. People fled their homes. Many never returned. The effects of hunger go far beyond the physical. Famine unravels the threads that hold society together. When food becomes scarce, trust disappears. Families grow secretive. Communities turn inward. Neighbors stop sharing. Rumors spread like wildfire about hoarding, about theft, about strange omens. Governments, even those with strong armies and long-standing laws, are often helpless in the face of famine. No order can make the fields yield. No decree can summon the sun. In Constantinople, the imperial court debated reforms and raised levies. But in the provinces, the people starved. In China, the emperor was seen as the mediator between heaven and earth. So when the heavens grew dark and crops failed, many believed the emperor had lost heaven's favor. Rebellions followed. In the Eyeside West, where the old Roman authority had fractured into smaller kingdoms and warring tribes, there was little anyone could do. Lords retreated to their keeps. Peasants hid in forests. Monasteries, once places of knowledge and stability, found themselves overwhelmed by the hungry and the sick. Trade routes collapsed. The great highways of the Roman world, once alive with wagons and travelers, grew silent. Inns were abandoned. Bridges went unrepaired. Markets dissolved. Livestock perished, not just from starvation, but from disease. Starving animals are vulnerable to infections. When food is scarce, even grass becomes poison. Horses, oxen, pigs, chickens, all essential to rural economies, began to die in large numbers. Without oxen to plow the fields, there could be no recovery. Without horses to carry messages, kingdoms became isolated. Without animals to feed on, hunger deepened. And into this grim reality crept another horror, the loss of meaning. When people suffer without cause, they search for explanations. Today we understand volcanic eruptions and climate anomalies. We know about stratospheric dust, aerosol particles, and atmospheric circulation. But in 536, science as we know it did not exist. So people turned to what they did know: faith, legend, and fear. To them, the dimming sun was not a climate event. It was a sign, a punishment, the wrath of the gods, the anger of heaven, the beginning of the end. Some believed the day of judgment had come. In Christian lands, priests preached repentance. They warned of divine anger, of sins unatoned for, of the need for sacrifice and humility. In the East, Taoists and Buddhists interpreted the events as cosmic imbalance. Temples burned incense, pilgrimages increased, offerings piled high. In the pagan fringes of Europe, druids and shamans revived old rituals. Fires were lit, animals were sacrificed. In desperate corners of the world, even humans may have been offered up. The psychological toll was immense. When days are gray and cold and the fields are empty and your children cry with hunger and no one has answers, what happens to the human mind? Many broke. Anxiety became a constant. Nightmares stalked the sleep of the young and old alike. The line between dream and waking blurred. Some withdrew into silence, others lashed out. Violence surged. Witch hunts began. Not the kind associated with later centuries, but smaller, quieter acts of scapegoating. A sick woman accused of poisoning the well. A traveler blamed for bad luck. A child cast out for being born under the wrong moon. Communities once united by kinship now fractured under the weight of suspicion. People moved, hoping to find better land. Refugees wandered across borders. This migration spread more fear. Foreigners were distrusted. Some were attacked. Others enslaved. Even within families, desperation sowed division. Food was hidden. Elders went unfed. In some cases, children were abandoned. These are not tales told with pride. They are the quiet truths of a desperate time. The world had entered a phase of collapse. Not sudden, not dramatic, but slow, choking, relentless. The air, still laced with ash, carried illness. The earth, exhausted, gave nothing, and the sky remained gray. Religious leaders competed with mystics. Charismatic preachers arose, warning of fire and eternal punishment. Some attracted followers, others incited riots. A few were killed for spreading false hope. In urban centers, beggars multiplied. Corpses lay unburied. Cemeteries overflowed. Some bodies were cast into rivers. Others burned. Monasteries attempted to care for the dying, but they too suffered from hunger and plague. The scribes who once copied ancient texts now spent their days digging graves, and still, the sun did not shine. In the minds of the people, the world was ending, not with a bang, but with a whisper. Not with fire, but with cold. Not with conquest, but with emptiness. The world's great empires staggered. The Eastern Roman Empire fought to hold its provinces. The Persian Empire to the east faced its own internal strife. In India, dynasties rose and fell in quick succession. In China, the Northern Wei fractured, ushering in chaos. This was a global collapse, not of total extinction, but of hope. A long, drawn-out unraveling of what people thought life was supposed to be. And just when it seemed the world might recover, when the skies began ever so slightly to clear, something worse arrived. In 541 AD, only 5 years after the sun dimmed, death came not from the sky, but from the rats beneath the floorboards, the fleas in the grain, the ships in the harbors. It began in Egypt. It boarded a grain ship. And it made its way to the beating heart of the empire, Constantinople. The plague had arrived, but that is another chapter. Chapter 3. The Plague of Justinian. Death rides. And the people had just begun to adjust. The skies were still dim. The air still colder than it should have been, but life was struggling forward. Crops were being coaxed from stubborn soil. Traders were returning to cautious routes. Families were rebuilding from years of hunger and darkness. Then, in 541 AD, death arrived again. This time, it was not cold or famine. This time, it wore a darker mask. It arrived quietly, hidden in the bowels of a ship from Egypt. Among the grain, sacks were rats. Among the rats, fleas. And within those fleas, a microscopic killer, Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that causes bubonic plague. It crept into Constantinople unnoticed, the greatest city of the Eastern Roman Empire. The beating heart of Justinian's rule was rich, bustling, and proud. Its markets overflowed with spices and silks, its streets alive with merchants and pilgrims. But beneath the cobblestones and under the tiled roofs, the rats ran free. They thrived in the narrow alleys, the sewers, the warehouses. They followed. The ships and the fleas followed them. At first, the plague's presence was unclear. A few people fell ill, high fevers, swollen lumps under the arms and groin, delirium, rapid death. Then came more. Dozens, then hundreds, then thousands. The disease moved faster than the authorities could comprehend. There was no concept of bacteria or contagion. People blamed bad air, divine wrath, or even strange foreign customs. But blame did not slow the spread. Within weeks, Constantinople was under siege, not from foreign armies, but from death itself. The historian John of Ephesus recorded the horror in grim detail. He spoke of entire households falling ill within days, of the dead lying where they fell, on floors, in beds, in the streets. There were too many corpses and too few hands to bury them. Gravediggers worked until they collapsed from exhaustion, or joined the dead themselves. Eventually, there were no more gravediggers. The living began to pile the dead in corners, in homes, in city squares. Some were cast into the sea, others burned in great funeral pyres, the smoke thick with the scent of decay. The Emperor Justinian himself fell ill. He survived, but barely. Many in his court were not so fortunate. Servants, nobles, guards, merchants, monks, none were spared. At the height of the outbreak, it is believed that as many as 10,000 people were dying every single day in Constantinople alone. The death toll was staggering, and it was only the beginning. The plague did not end with a single wave. It returned again and again in cycles for more than 200 years. It spread far beyond Constantinople, across the Mediterranean, into the Middle East, North Africa, and eventually into Western Europe. By land and sea, through rivers and roads, it followed the movement of people. Soldiers, traders, pilgrims, anyone could be a carrier. The rats needed no invitation. They simply followed the food, the filth, the warmth. Entire towns were depopulated. In some regions, the dead outnumbered the living. Archaeological records and written accounts paint a picture of devastation. Cemeteries were expanded, then abandoned. Mass graves became the norm. In rural areas, entire villages disappeared from records. Fields went untilled. Roads were overgrown. Trade networks collapsed once more. No merchant dared travel if it meant passing through a plague town. Ports were closed. Markets emptied. The economy withered. And with the economy went the systems of power. Tax collection faltered. Laws could not be enforced. Armies shrank, not from desertion, but from death. Entire units were lost to plague. Fortresses were left unguarded. In many cases, local governance simply ceased to exist. The impact on the empire was enormous. The Emperor Justinian had harbored grand dreams of restoring the Roman Empire to its former glory. He had reconquered parts of North Africa and Italy, but with the plague came economic ruin. His wars stalled. Resources were redirected toward survival. The dream of imperial restoration faded. Some historians believe that the plague of Justinian directly contributed to the weakening of the Eastern Roman Empire and the later success of Islamic expansion across formerly Byzantine territories. Beyond politics, the plague left a deeper, more intimate scar. The psychological toll was immense. How does a person survive when surrounded by death on all sides? When family members die in days? When entire streets are silent? Religious belief surged. Some found solace in prayer. Others turned to apocalyptic visions. They saw the plague as punishment, as a sign of divine disfavor. In some cases, new religious movements arose, offering hope, penance, or mystical healing. Superstition returned in full force. Strange cures were tried: herbs, amulets, chants. Some believed that loud noises could drive away the pestilence. Others fled into the countryside, hoping the plague would not follow. Many died alone. Doctors were powerless. Medicine in this age was limited. There were no antibiotics, no understanding of germs. The best physicians could offer were warm compresses, bloodletting, or aromatic herbs. None of it worked. The sick were often isolated, or hidden, or cast out. Some were locked in their homes and left to die. The nature of the plague made it all the more terrifying. The buboes, painful, swollen lymph nodes, would appear within days of infection. The fever would rise, the mind would falter. Some died in agony. Others drifted into coma-like sleep and never woke. The speed was shocking. A person could be healthy in the morning and dead by nightfall. Entire families died within days. Funerals, once sacred, became impossible. Last rites were skipped. Priests themselves were dying too quickly. In some towns, the church bells tolled without stopping. Then they fell silent, and as this all unfolded, the sun still had not fully returned. The skies remained gray for years. The winters were bitter. The harvests remained poor. In many regions, food remained scarce even during brief lulls between plague outbreaks. It was as if the world itself had turned against humanity. This was a multi-front assault: climate, famine, and now plague. And it lasted not for a year, but for generations. The plague of Justinian didn't simply come and go. It returned again and again, re-emerging every 10 to 20 years, claiming more lives each time. Estimates suggest that between 30 to 50 million people died. At the time, that represented over a third, possibly even half, of the entire population of Europe and the Mediterranean world. It is hard to comprehend what that means. Imagine walking through a town where every second door stands open, the house within empty. Imagine roads with no travelers, rivers without boats, markets where no voices call. Imagine a world where birth is rare and death is constant. This was the world shaped by the plague of Justinian, and it left a long shadow. Social structures changed. Some areas never recovered. Languages were lost. Towns vanished. Skills, crafts, and knowledge disappeared with those who once held them. But even in the face of all this, people endured. They farmed. They prayed. They told stories to their children. They built new homes atop the ruins of the old. Human history is not only a chronicle of suffering, it is also a record of survival. Still, for many who lived between 541 and 750 AD, survival came at great cost. They endured the fading sun, the hunger of empty fields, and then, at last, the invisible breath of death carried on the wind. The worst time to be a human had entered its deadliest phase, and the world would never be the same again. Chapter 4: A World Without Comfort. Now let's pause the grand sweep of empires and epidemics for a moment. Step away from the emperors, the wars, and the natural cataclysms. Let's zoom in, not on a city, not on a nation, but on a single life. One life, lived in the shadows of 536 AD. You are not a ruler. You're not a scholar or a soldier. You're simply a farmer's daughter, born into a world teetering on the edge of collapse. You live in a small village somewhere in what we now call Northern Europe. But names don't matter much to you. Neither do borders. What matters is survival. Each morning, you wake up on a mattress of straw. It itches, and it's home to more than just the occasional bug. You share this cramped, smoke-darkened hut with your mother, 2 younger siblings, and your aging grandmother. Your father died the year the sky turned dark, felled by a fever that came with the strange cold. You remember him sometimes. His laughter before the hunger thinned his voice, before his eyes dimmed with disease. Your home has no glass window. Just a small opening covered by a wooden shutter that keeps out little of the wind and none of the cold. Smoke from the central fire pit curls upward and stings your eyes, but it offers what little warmth your family can afford. There is no chimney, just a hole in the roof, and even that is clogged with soot. You haven't tasted meat in weeks. The chickens stopped laying. The goats went dry. Last winter, you had to help your mother bury the cow when it collapsed in the mud, starved, like so many others. You tried to chew the leather from old boots once, boiled to softness, but it made you sick for days. The grain stores are almost empty now. The last of the salted fish turned moldy weeks ago. You picked through it anyway, scraping off the green. Patches. Your mother cried when she saw you do it, but she didn't stop you, because she didn't have anything better to offer. Summer doesn't feel like summer anymore. The sky is a dull, endless gray. The air is damp and still. You've heard the elders whisper that the sun has been stolen. Some say the gods are punishing the world. Others blame demons, or sorcerers, or sins too old to name. You are always cold. Even when you wrap yourself in the woolen shawl that once belonged to your grandmother's grandmother, you shiver. Your feet have cracked from dampness, and your hands bleed at the knuckles. Sometimes, when the wind blows, it howls through the trees like a voice. You try not to listen to what it says. Your brother died last winter. He was only 9. Fever took him after 3 days. There were no herbs left to treat him, no honey, no clean water, no help. He was buried in the frozen ground outside the village, wrapped in linen, without a priest. Your mother hasn't spoken his name since. Now your neighbor coughs through the night. A hacking, wet cough that echoes through the walls. You worry it's the plague you've heard about, though you don't know exactly what that means. Only that people die quickly, that they bleed, that they vanish into pits of bodies. But maybe it's just the cold, or hunger, or grief. It all kills just the same. Your mother sometimes speaks in whispers to herself. At night, when she thinks you're asleep, she rocks by the fire and murmurs to the shadows. She talks to your father, to your brother, to the saints. She lights a tallow candle and prays, her voice cracked and low. Once, she swore she saw a demon crouching near the door, black eyes, long arms, teeth like bone. You never saw it, but you believe her. There is no medicine, no doctor, no midwife since the last one died. When women go into labor, they do so alone or with the help of frightened friends. Some live, many don't. You've seen it yourself. The blood, the silence afterward. It lingers in the air like smoke. A miracle, they say, to survive childbirth. But miracles are in short supply. There's no anesthesia, no understanding of infection. If you cut yourself, you pray it doesn't fester. If it does, you wait and hope your body is stronger than the rot. Your friend once broke her leg. There was no way to set it. Her father tried using a stick and cloth. She screamed for hours, then days, then stopped screaming altogether. No one talks about her anymore. Water comes from the stream, but the stream is low and cloudy. You boil it when you can. When you can't, you take your chances. You've had stomach pains for weeks now. Your belly cramps at night. You've grown used to the ache like a second heartbeat. There is no soap, just ashes and sand. No warm shower, no laundry but cold water and raw hands. Your clothes are patched and stiff from wear. Your hair is braided to keep the lice at bay, but they always return. And if you wanted to run, where would you go? There is no haven. The forest is full of wolves, both the animal kind and the human kind. Roads are watched by bandits, desperate men with nothing to lose. Towns may have more food, but they also carry more disease, more strangers, more chances to disappear. You've heard rumors of war, far-off kings fighting for scraps of empire, soldiers moving through the countryside, looting, burning. You don't know their names. You just know that where they go, suffering follows. There are whispers of monasteries that offer food, of cities where the sun still shines. But no one you know has seen these places. They are stories passed around like prayers. Half hope, half illusion. So you stay. You work. You tend the hearth and gather what little is left in the fields. You wake before the light and sleep after the fire dies. And you don't speak of tomorrow, because you're not sure there will be a tomorrow. Your world is not made of days and nights, but of moments strung together by instinct, hunger, fear, sorrow, brief flashes of laughter, like lightning in a storm. When it rains, you place buckets to catch the water. When the wind howls, you cover your siblings' ears. When your mother stares too long into the flames, you put a hand on her shoulder. And when the village bell rings, slow and solemn, you know someone else is gone. Sometimes you dream of color, of green grass and blue skies and fields full of grain. You dream of warmth, of music, of honey and bread. But you wake to gray, to silence, to the smell of smoke and mud. This is your world, a world without comfort, without safety, without peace, and yet you endure, because endurance is all you've ever known. Chapter 5. The End of Knowledge. This wasn't just a collapse of crops or health. It wasn't just dark skies or famine. It wasn't even just death. It was the unraveling of civilization itself. The very fabric of what once held the ancient world together, its culture, its knowledge, its progress, was torn apart. thread by thread. The libraries that once echoed with the quiet rustle of parchment and the voices of scholars went silent. Dust settled on scrolls that no one would ever read again. Many of them burned, not in grand bonfires of conquest, but simply forgotten, left to rot in empty buildings as the world outside descended into chaos. Monasteries that once protected sacred texts were raided. Others closed their doors too, poor or too afraid to protect their collections. The wealth of the ancient world, mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, engineering, was lost not all at once, but steadily, like a river drying up. Trade routes, those lifelines that connected, great civilizations from Rome to China collapsed. Merchants stayed home, ships rotted in harbors, caravans stopped coming. Where there had once been silk from the east, spices from India, and papyrus from Egypt, now there was just silence and suspicion. Borders hardened, but not with walls, with fear. Nobody traveled and nobody shared ideas. You couldn't afford how disease might follow the next visitor, or bandits, or worse. Cities that had thrived for centuries became ghost towns. Some disappeared entirely, swallowed by the forests or the sands. Their names vanished from maps. Their monuments, once grand, crumbled into ruins. Entire generations passed without knowing what had once stood on those lands. People who lived beside ancient temples couldn't even name the gods they were built for. In the West, the Roman world faded like a dying candle. The road systems that once spanned continents were now dangerous to travel. They cracked and crumbled, overtaken by weeds and wild animals. Bridges that had connected regions became impassable, swallowed by rivers swollen with neglect. Aqueducts dried up. Public baths were abandoned. Forums, once bustling with debates and trade, were reduced to empty stones. The fall wasn't loud. It was slow, quiet, a forgetting. Teachers, once the torchbearers of knowledge, had no one to teach. They starved or fled or were killed in the violence. The Latin tongue, once the language of empire, began to fracture. Local dialects twisted it, mutated it, until the common people no longer understood the classics. Virgil, Cicero, and Seneca became strangers to the world they once inspired. The Eastern Empire, the Byzantines, fought to keep the light burning. For a while they held on, but even they were battered by disease, famine, and the loss of global trade. Their cities shrank, their defenses thinned. The treasures of Constantinople, glittering with gold and mosaics, became isolated islands in a dark sea. Philosophy, once the pride of Greece and Rome, became suspect. In the absence of food and security, abstract thinking seemed like a luxury. Who could ponder ethics while starving? Who could debate logic while burying their children? The schools closed, the academies emptied, and where rational thought once bloomed, now came only superstition. It wasn't just ignorance, it was fear, and in that fear came brutality. In the absence of reason, people needed explanations for their suffering. They needed someone to blame. The stars no longer guided farmers. The weather no longer followed seasons, so people turned to omens, to curses, to demons. Priests and warlords filled the vacuum left by scientists and scholars. Slavery, long present in human history, surged. With no laws to protect the weak, the powerful did as they pleased. The loss of central governance meant there were no courts, no enforcers of justice. If a noble wanted laborers, he took them. If a man fell into debt, his children could be sold to pay it. Women became bargaining chips, traded like cattle between clans and kingdoms. Witch hunts began, not the ones of the late medieval period, but early seeds of them. Misfortune was now personal. If your crops failed, it wasn't the weather, it was the old woman down the road. If your child died, someone must have cursed you. The idea of natural causes faded, replaced by paranoia. And the punishments were swift. A whisper could cost you your life. Families shrank, not just from death, but from the fear of bringing children into such a world. Those who did have children often lost them young. Infancy was no longer a stage. Of life, it was a battlefield. If the child survived birth, they might still succumb to starvation, exposure, or infection. Some parents left newborns in the woods, not from cruelty, but from hopelessness. The household no longer belonged to a society. It belonged to a lord, or a war band, or a bandit chief. You were no longer a citizen. You were a subject. If you resisted, you were punished. If you tried to flee, there was nowhere to run. Entire generations grew up never seeing a book, never hearing music not played by a local peasant, never knowing that the world had once reached the stars with its thoughts. Children were born into a world of mud and fear, and they died in it, never knowing it could have been different. Religion was not a comfort, it was a weapon, used to justify war, to control the masses, to silence dissent. Holy men declared disasters as signs of divine wrath. Heretics were burned, pagan symbols were smashed. And yet, behind closed doors, people still prayed to old gods in secret, just in case. The world became smaller. Local, insular, a village of 50 people was your universe. You rarely traveled more than a mile from where you were born. You didn't know what lay beyond the next hill. And you feared it. And with that shrinking came cruelty. There was no empathy for the stranger, no curiosity for the unknown. If someone looked different or spoke strangely, they were an enemy. Hospitality died. Suspicion replaced it. The dream of humanity, that upward arc of learning, building, discovering, was halted. Some would argue it even reversed. In 1,000 small ways, the light dimmed. People forgot how to make mortar, how to build arches, how to measure the stars, and most tragically, how to imagine. For imagination is a fragile thing. It needs safety, space, hope. And in the centuries following 536, all of those were in short supply. By the time distant generations looked back, they gave this time a name, the Dark Ages. But the darkness wasn't just in the skies, it was in the minds, a deep forgetting, a loss of self, a time when the worst part of being human was not just suffering, but not even knowing that life could be more than suffering. You were not part of an empire anymore. You were not part of a golden age. You were a peasant, a servant, a shadow moving through the ruins of a forgotten world, guided not by knowledge or vision, but by hunger, fear, and cold. And in that shadow, the worst time to be a human quietly marched on.